Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to this webinar session on sustainable growing media, a hot topic in horticulture today, and one we'll discuss with you, a truly international audience. We've got people from some 50 countries online with us today. But before we start, let me give you a brief explanation on a few technical details. Via the orange arrow on the right side of your screen, you can drop down your dashboard and adjust your webcam settings. Please do not hesitate to ask questions throughout the sessions. We will moderate them and ask them to the keynote speakers. You can use the question pane for that, and also do not forget to download the presentation of today you find in the handout section. This webinar will be recorded. You will receive the recording afterwards by email for your reference. And let me briefly introduce myself. My name is René Snijders. I present this event from Costa Rica together with
Ed Smith, and we facilitate this on behalf of Floriculture International and AIPH. Today's agenda is as follows. First of all, we have three keynote speakers with us. Mr. Marko Pomerants of the International Peatland Society, Ms. Cecilia Luetgebrune of Growing Media Europe, and Ms. Catherine Dawson of Melcourt in the UK. After their keynote presentations, we will reflect on and discuss the theme Sustainable Growing Media in more detail with an expert panel consisting of Mr. Moritz Böking of Klasman Delman, Mr. Peter van der Dool van the Knap Group, and Ms. Hein Boon of RHP. Conservative estimates indicate that within the next 10 years, controlled environment agriculture, production in greenhouses and indoor farms will double. The percentage of hydroponic indoor facilities will increase significantly. In other words, it is fair to assume that we will need at least triple the amount of substrates some 10 years from now. We have a huge challenge ahead of us.
With us, the Secretary General of AIPH, and please, Ed, see if we can have the presentation with us on screen. Mr. Tim Brearcliffe. Tim, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, thank you. Okay, so to the next slide then, please. And my name is Tim Brearcliffe. I'm the Secretary General of AIPH, the International Association of Horticultural Producers, and I'm delighted that we can bring this webinar to you today, and thanks to Jungle Talks for their support in this, and ICL for their sponsorship support as well. AIPH exists to be the world's champion for the power of plants and to support the demand for ornamental trees, plants and flowers worldwide. And if we go to the next slide, please. We have members across, our members are associations that represent the interests of ornamentals growers, and we have members across the world. Anyone interested in joining as an organization or company can also join as an affiliate member as well if you are interested in the work that we are doing. Next slide, please. We're engaged in many different areas of activity supporting the industry. We have a role in approving international horticultural exhibitions, such as the Floriada that will be opening next year in the Netherlands. We're active on promoting the green city and the importance of plants and the landscape in improving the environment and tackling climate change. And we support growers in technical issues, such as in plant health, and we produce statistics through our regular statistical yearbook that we produce with Union Fleur. Next slide, please. Our statistical yearbook has been going now for 68 years, so we've been doing it for a long time, and we're looking also at developing, this is available, that you can access from our website directly. The next slide, please. Just this last week, we launched our International Grower of the Year Awards for 2022, and we're encouraging ornamentals growers around the world to enter this competition. and through the summer period, and then we will, the jury will assess the entries through the autumn, and then we hope to announce the winners during the IPMS and trade event in Germany in January. So please have a look at the website for more information about that, and encourage growers in your country to enter these great awards. Now, next slide, please. AIPH is the publisher of Floriculture International that is running these webinars, and we would encourage you to register for free. Please visit the website, and subscription is free of charge, and we provide a lot of content, and please follow us on the various social media channels. The next slide, please. We have a number of other webinars being planned for the rest of the year. One on the global potted plants industry, focusing on indoor foliage plants, one on the industry in Mexico, and one on the wedding market for flowers. So if you're interested in these topics, please make a note for your diaries or check the website for more information. Next slide, please. Now, I have deliberately gone quite quickly through those slides because I want to make a little bit more of an introduction on this topic. You know, we could not have planned the timing of today better. As we are meeting now, the UK Government Environment Minister is announcing plans to ban the horticultural use of peat in the UK as we speak. He wants to ban peat use in bagged growing media sold to the public by 2024, and for professional use as well after that. But of course, this has implications not just in the UK. The discussion about peat and sustainability is not a new one, and has been part of personally my entire career really in horticulture. I finished my horticulture degree back in '97, and from there I went to work in consultancy, and it wasn't long before I was working on peat alternative trials and demonstration workshops for growers as the industry in the UK aimed to meet government peat reduction targets of 60% by 2002, 90% by 2010. By 2010, I was managing the UK's Growing Media Association, among other things, and trying to bring all the stakeholders together to tackle this issue. The driver for this change in the beginning was the loss of lowland raised bogs that were an important habitat for wildlife. It wasn't long before these particularly sensitive peat bogs were protected, and many that had been harvested were restored. Peat was sourced instead from other areas or imported from Ireland or the Baltic states. Despite the fact that the original environmental issue had been addressed, the targets stayed, and campaign groups kept the pressure on government to stop the use of peat for horticulture. As the issue of climate change grew, then the role of peat bogs as carbon stores became the new reason to campaign for peat staying where it was in the ground. The arguments on just how much an end to peat harvesting would actually reduce carbon emissions could be and has been debated endlessly. But despite the debates about the science, NGOs have successfully persuaded successive governments to try to end the use of peat for horticulture in the UK. Not unusually, British growers felt alone on this issue, with the issue of peat not really registering in the rest of Europe during that period, and there remained many challenges on delivering peat reduction. In the UK, governments have left it to industry and have avoided bans and taxes on peat. But that's at least until today, when we have heard more about that. But therein also lies the problem. Peat has for so long proven itself as a brilliant growing media in terms of quality, consistency, availability, and cost effectiveness. Apart from a few enthusiasts, the gardening public have failed to engage on the issue, and bad experiences with early peat alternatives only serve to strengthen demand for peat itself. Retailers have been left to drive the change, but in the end, the economics have always been against them. Every country, though, will have its own story to tell about peat, but the number of countries represented on this webinar shows the issue is now an international one. In the end, it is hard to justify the sustainability of something that you dig from the ground and it takes thousands of years to replenish. But it's also important that any alternative is more sustainable. The difficulty with alternatives revolve around quality, consistency, availability, and price. But we are part of an industry that is not put off by a challenge. We are an industry that is in the business of providing sustainability. And therefore, I am confident that together we'll find the right path. And on behalf of AIPH and Floriculture International, I'm delighted with the speakers that have joined the discussion today, and I hope today's webinar will play its own important role in moving us forward on this important topic. Thank you for listening, and now over to the webinar proper. Back to you, Renee and Ed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, but on these occasions, but especially today, because the topic is so dear to your heart. So let's indeed go first to Marko Pomerants, the president of the International Peatland Society. Marko, I hope that you are with us. I see your presentation coming up on the screen. I hope that we can see and hear you as well.
I am on place
Yes.
in
Perfect.
Estonia. We have afternoon, and I am in small town called Rakvere, and closest greenhouse is 20 meters from me. But I'd like to show what I plan to spread with you today, and here is my presentation, and it's about growing media, of course. And I suppose that everybody sees my first slide, and it's about title, only potatoes, question mark. Why potatoes? In Estonia, potato is like a symbol vegetable. If we talk of our food, it starts from the potatoes. We add maybe pork, or we did it in history, but the potato is important. Now about IPS, it's International Peatland Society. We had just 16th International Peatland Congress behind. And if we talk about size of congresses or webinars in nowadays, then we had 384 persons attended us, and we heard 185 oral presentations. And we had also a second industry summit. And if we talk about what are my impressions for today, then you can see them on next slide. Like to talk about different keywords which are important if we talk about peat use and growing media. And very often we can see that we take those people who extract peat and those people who are wetting wetlands like enemies, or they are different, but actually they are not alternatives, because those people in industry who extract the peat, they can nicely rewet wetlands and even make a nice ecological recovery. So we should just change that understanding that those are just different persons. And what is important to remember that, and you know it very well, that gardening is not just about the food. And if we talk about COVID period which we had, I think it's question of mental health also, because in terms of Estonia, you can't buy a small greenhouse right now because you have queues. It was said by Maurice Doyon from Laval University about peat. If better substitutes exist, they would be used. And I think it's right, because if we look what kind of amounts are used worldwide, then anyway peat stays as a top growing media. And if we use estimates made by Professor Chris Block from 2020, then we can see that there is huge increase of demand for 2050. And of course, if we talk about percentages, then we can see that the need for wood fiber will be increased hundreds of percents. But anyway, if we talk about total amounts, it's still about a peat, and we can't deny it. And Maurice Doyon said that in Canada they estimated what will be just the price of different other substitutes and what will be the second best, and they ended with cocoa. But if we talk about business, then you can't get it with the same price. And then if we talk about food, we should talk about ability or willingness to pay. And it's not only about substitutes, it's also about water ability, and I think in longer run also energy prices. And it's not only substitutes issue, and we should take all those costs also into account. In today's battlefield about with peat or without peat, I think our common main problem is connected to the data gaps and data aging. For example, if we talk about energy peat and we use data from 2017, then it's already like old data, because if we take, for example, case of Bornamona or situation in Finland, 2017 and 2021, they are totally different. And yeah, if we want to understand how much we use peat today, you have a mix of tons and cubic meters, and it is problematical to just deliver proper data. And I think if we talk about, for example, next IPC, International Peatland Congress, maybe the data collecting will be just topic for all days. Cooperation instead of competition. What I mean that all those organizations like IPS or Growing Media Europe or Global Peatland Initiative, they should cooperate, because our voice is still not so loud. Of course, CO2 emissions are most important in such discussions, but the real cause isn't just peat extraction. The real cause is population growth. And if we look what kind of situation we have 2100, for example, then we have 10 billion people and they have demands. And of course, the question is where the emissions should be taken into account. Most probably you know about it, and if we talk about Maslow hierarchy of needs, in the bottom or baseline we have physiological needs, and here is all again a picture of potato, and somehow it's connected to security. And if we just go up by that Maslow pyramid, then we just arrive to love needs or esteem needs, and maybe the top of top is just such a topic as a self-actualization. And what I want to say is following that we can't just talk about food security in our world. The upper levels are also very important, and if we talk about just growing media sector as such, then I think in our messages we should take all that into account. And it's my final slide. Think about if one day will appear such a regulation. It's right now a draft regulation. Then in 2030, for example, we can't use any more cut flowers and grown in horticulture in Valentine's Days or family celebrations, and we can't use any more fresh funeral flowers by 2050. And our ash will be used in road construction. I want to say that we should take all that picture of flowers and vegetables and keep it all the time in mind. And I don't think that somebody is ready for such a world where we have only potatoes. Thank you.
I would like to invite to the virtual stage Ms. Cecilia Luetgebrune of Growing Media Europe. Thank you, Cecilia, for being with us today as well. We can already see you. I hope we can hear you as well.
Yes, hello from Brussels. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. So thank you to Floriculture and the AIPH for inviting me. Thank you. Hello from Brussels to everybody. And yes, before I start with the actual topic, let me just briefly introduce Growing Media Europe. So we are the association representing the producers of growing media and soil improver on European level. We are based here in Brussels. We have now 22 company members and 15 national associations as members. And our main job is really being the focal point between this industry sector and the European institutions, but not only the institutions, also, of course, other stakeholders like NGOs, related industries, media, and science. We work science-based. That is very important in these times to highlight. And transparent. We represent all constituents, and our focus as an association is really on the end product. And that's also why today, of course, I'm happy to talk about peat, and we often talk about peat, but I think the title really is Sustainable Growing Media, so I'll try to focus a bit more on the end product, on our wonderful products, growing media. If we talk about growing media, it's always a good idea to start with looking a bit at the market perspective. And a lot of things have been said already by Tim and Marko. And I think, yeah, it's no surprise to you that the demand for growing media is really going through the roof. It was mentioned already, there is this study from Wageningen University predicting the demand to grow between now and 2050 by more than 400%. So the demand is really exploding, and that's also no surprise if you look at all those trends that I've listed there. People tend to eat more fruits and vegetables. People tend to buy more flowers, especially now in the lockdown. It was already said, for mental well-being. Surrounding yourself with green and colorful flowers obviously contributes to mental health. There's trends in architecture like green walls, green rooftops. The European Union has the ambitious goal of planting 3 billion trees between now and 2050. GME just had a webinar on that topic last week, so afforestation is a big topic as well. And then if you look at it simply from a grower's perspective, if you look at the most pressing challenges that growers have today, it's labor. It's more and more hard to find labor. It's the weather that is very unpredictable. Might become even worse if you take climate change into account. And then the price is going up for important resources like fertilizer, plant protection, water, and so on. And of course, all those challenges can be at least partially solved by switching from growing an open field into to growing in growing media. And we do really see that there is a transformation going on in horticulture, and that really adds to the increasing demand for our products. So that's the market outlook, which is good news, of course, if you are a growing media producer. And again, good news from our perspective, if you look at the political angle on European level, if you look at the Green Deal, when the Green Deal was published, and especially under that big roof called Green Deal, those initiatives called Farm to Fork strategy, biodiversity strategy, and the forest strategy, we really were very happy here at GME because we saw a lot of opportunities. And that's clear because our products, they already contribute to several of the objectives in the European Green Deal. And I've listed you a few here. I will not go through all of them, but the overall message here is that our products are already really boosters of sustainability and making food production, but also production of ornamental flowers, trees, and so on, already more sustainable today. And that's why we see actually a lot of opportunities on political level. So good news from a demand perspective and from, in general, also from a political direction perspective. But then, of course, why are we here today and what are we talking about today? What is a sustainable growing medium? That is the main question that I was asked to prepare for today for this webinar. And this is how GME is defining a sustainable growing medium. The most important point, and most important because it's often forgotten, is the first one, fit for purpose. Because what if you have theoretically a growing medium that is socially compliant, that has a very low environmental footprint, and that somehow, maybe because of some marketing strategies, even works from an economic point of view. But if then the plants don't really grow in it, right? So if the agronomic efficiency is low, can that be sustainable, right? That's a question that is hardly ever raised. And from our perspective, it's not sustainable per definition if it's not fit for purpose. So always important to keep that in mind. And then, of course, sustainability is not only the environment, it's society and economics as well. And Growing Media Europe has just finalized a life cycle project, will be published most likely in the next 2 weeks. We hope, and well, the outcome is as expected, more or less, that there is no good or bad constituent when it comes to growing media production. They all have an environmental footprint. This life cycle assessment was only about environment, so that's important to mention. But there is no good or bad, so they all have their pros and cons. And that's why we say that all constituents can be sustainable if sourced responsibly, and that includes peat. It's always a question of how it's sourced and which factors you take into account. Obviously, as a sector, our goal is to always ensure responsible and sustainable practices along the whole production chain. But yeah, important to keep in mind, growing media per se already contribute a lot to sustainability. And of course, a growing medium per se has to also fulfill certain criteria in order to be sustainable. And then next slide is the question, okay, how do we as the industry, as GME, tackle this topic of sustainability? We have 3 pillars that we follow. We are, like I said in the beginning, a science-based organization, so we really work science-based. That's why we've just finalized this LCA project on the environmental footprints of all our constituents. We also have started to gather more data on our own sector, which is not a very easy task, but we're really on it. And we have stepped up our efforts in that regard as well lately. Then, yes, we are, of course, a lobby organization, if you want to call it like that. So public affairs is our core business. And we have recently also really invested in that aspect. So we have a stronger team now in the secretariat. We have created a public affairs working group internally. We have pushed our members to engage stronger, and we have created new communication tools. We have started also a webinar series on the Green Deal and the link to our sector. And every week we have bilateral meetings with decision makers from the Commission, the Parliament, and so on, to really educate about what we do, why our products contribute to sustainability, and the big important message that there is no good or bad constituent. It always depends on a lot of factors. And yes, Marko, you said it as well, alliance building is very important. And of course, we are in constant exchange with, for example, the IPS. We try to always keep each other up to date and help each other out with data and so on. That's the international level. And of course, at European level, we also are very active building alliances with other related industry sectors. So basically, to summarize it in one or two sentences, our focus is really on the end product, which is already contributing a lot to sustainability. Not saying there's nothing more we should do. There's always room for improvement, and we're working on that. But we really see that we have a key role to fulfill in the European Green Deal, and that is really the key message here. And I'm happy to answer questions now or in the panel, or if you have more questions that won't be answered today, please visit our website. You will find my email address there. Always happy to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for being with us today and for your presentation. It all went well in the end. Just getting back, there's one question from the audience that came in. How can peat be sustainable? What is your opinion on how can peat be sustainable when it takes so long, thousands of years to replenish?
Well, peat can be sustainable if it's taken from previously degraded peat box, which is in Europe the case. So I think Marko mentioned it as well. There's actually the public debate is always about we should restore all those degraded peatlands. And yes, we absolutely agree. There's a lot of degraded peatlands that have been degraded mainly for agriculture and forestry that are out there emitting, and that's not a good situation. And our sector is happy to help the European Union, for example, reaching their European restoration targets. So yes, it is very important to restore all those degraded peatlands. But please, if you look at the science again, only a tiny part of the already degraded peatlands is used for peat extraction and restored, always restored after we use it. And it's proven that if you restore it, it can become a carbon sink again. So we say, look, why can we not, while helping restore all those degraded peatlands out there that are mainly not restored, mainly not degraded because of our industry, but because of agriculture, we help you restore those, and at the same time, please let us use this tiny share of already degraded peatlands for our purposes, restoring it, bringing it back to a state where it can become a carbon sink, and also regain a high value in biodiversity.
Thank you, Cecilia. More questions like these will probably come up in the panel discussion. If necessary, we'll get back to you then. Thank you for now. We're virtually traveling to the UK and meet with Catherine Dawson. Catherine, thank you so much for being with us. You're representing Melcourt, a manufacturer of non-peat alternatives. For the UK, an exciting day. Today, lots of news on peat, so really on top of this hot topic. So please, Catherine, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Renee. And can I just check you can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen okay, all fine.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's a pleasure. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, England. Just for context, Melcourt is a company that's never dealt with peat. And we're far from being one of the bigger growing media manufacturers in the UK, but we've been very involved in the peat debate from the start. I would also like to say at this point that whatever anybody thinks about peat from an environmental standpoint, No one, not least ourselves, can deny that it makes a superb growing medium ingredient. I say that with feeling, as someone who spent a working life developing products to emulate the great properties that peat has. However, our principal raw materials are those of the forest byproducts. We operate from a principal site in Gloucestershire in the UK. We're a privately owned company, and our two shareholders are also in the forest industry. This is a large sawmill in Shropshire, and this is the largest handler of forest residues in the UK, in the north of England, A.W. Jenkinson Forest Products. And the point about that is that we are very well resourced from the point of view of both finance, but also our raw material needs. This is our principal growing medium ingredient. It's a composted blend of wood fibre and bark. So these are some of the headlines. This is a very old slide now from the early 1990s, but these are some of the headlines that were populating the horticultural trade press in the UK from that time. And in the first times, early times of this debate, it was all about biodiversity. Tim mentioned this, the first calls coming in the late 1980s, and the first targets from government by the mid-1990s, and you can see that one there, for peat to be reduced to 40% by 2005. And ironically, that's the level that we've just achieved in 2020, 15 years beyond that original target. And then 1999, 90% of the total market to be peat-free by 2010, amply missed. Then the drivers in the 2000s have been more about climate change, and our government has had various acts of parliament and policy documents that have mentioned peat and peat reduction, culminating in the targets that we're still working to, phasing out amateur gardening peat by 2020, again missed, and for all of horticulture in the UK by 2030. The government set up a sustainable growing media task force, people by all sides of the argument, so everything from people like us, the manufacturers, growers, NGOs, retailers, and organisations such as our Horticultural Trades Association, Royal Horticultural Society. Everybody was represented on the task force, and it was that task force that eventually produced our responsible sourcing scheme, which I will come back to in a minute. In 2018, the government produced its 25-year plan for the environment, and again, peat found its way into this document. The new statement, if by 2020 we haven't seen sufficient movement, we will look to introduce further measures. And it's those further measures that they've decided to start on. And they've just, in the last few days, produced the England Peat Action Plan. And this very day, as Tim mentioned, I woke up this morning to hearing about bagged peat on our main BBC News, which doesn't happen often. This is an excerpt from today's press release, that the measures that they're proposing will include a ban on sales of peat products, amateur that is, by the end of this Parliament, which is 2024, subject, and this is important, subject to consultation. So I think the intentions are clear. Something else that put shockwaves through our industry, and possibly until today's announcement and being in the news and everything, was this announcement in January that Bord na Móna, one of the main producers of peat used in the UK, announced that it was stopping peat harvesting for good, forever. This really turned the heads of people who until this moment hadn't really believed that it ever would really happen. This has made people sit up and really listen. So if we can't use peat, what are we using? And still 30 years after the start of the debate in this country, there's still only 4 materials, 2 of which are forest derived, that are being used in any quantity here. These are 2019 figures, and you can see peat sits way out in front. The 2020 figure is larger, something like 2.3 million cubic meters. The wood fibre figure is slightly larger for 2020. But essentially, the message is the same, that there's very little other than these 4 that are really making any headway in as what we'd call commercially sensible alternatives to peat. And this is how it looks between 2011 when the government white paper was introduced in 2020. So reduction is happening, but you can see here the total percentage for 2020 just sitting above 40%. And if you cast your mind back to that timeline, that was the original target that was purported in 1995. But so we're a bit late, but this is where we stand today. But as horticulturists, and there's already been made mention of this, it's one thing taking an environmental standpoint, but the stuff has still got to work, and the consequences of it not doing are just not something that certainly professional horticulture or even amateur gardening can put up with. I'm happy to say that us as a company with our peat-free products for professional growers and others, we're not the only ones, but these are just a few slides of some of our growers who are producing crops very successfully, very versatile, everything from seeds through to trees. And I would point out that these are slides, these growers have been doing this for a few years now in the context of there not being an awful lot of demand from the marketplace. The government has been making a lot of noise, as have the NGOs, but the market hasn't demanded it. But nevertheless, some of the best growers in the UK have grasped the mettle, and they're doing it commercially and competitively. They're not doing it for fun. And they like it from a technical point of view. A lot of the time it's the technical aspects that are driving this rather than the peat freeness, if you like. But will demand outstrip supply? Again, a 2019 figure, total volume 4.5 million cubic meters, of which 2.1 was peat. That's a very large hole to fill in the timeline that the government is talking about. And we have the issue of competing industries. Here's an example. This is a biomass power station in the south of Scotland, and that is one of 9 such power stations in the UK, solely powered by biomass. This is one of the larger ones, but as one facility, it's consuming 1/5 of the total growing media quantity in the UK. That sort of puts into context the amounts of wood chip, in this case, that one facility can consume compared to the total growing media market. However, the one thing that these power stations cannot deal with is the 0 to 10 millimeter. That has to be screened out, and useful byproducts that our industry is already using are arising from the fact that these power stations have had to go out and find new sources. So these are byproducts that the growing media industry is able to use that would not have been there without this heavily incentivized and subsidized power station biomass, these facilities. So that brings us to the question of price. Are peat alternatives more expensive? They can be, but as we've seen, there are plenty of commercial growers doing this, growing without peat very competitively and making it work. And here in the UK, questions now are really being asked, and I think this is a thrust of what the government's thinking, is that is the true environmental cost of peat being included in the value? And you have to understand that in the UK, the price of a bag of growing media is hardly any higher now than it was even 10 or even 15 years ago. So this is, I mean, we could spend an entire afternoon on this subject of the cost alone. So the responsible sourcing scheme came up with a promise at the outset. What we were aiming for: all growing media will be made from raw materials that are sourced and manufactured in a way that is both socially and environmentally responsible. And in order to judge that, 7 criteria were chosen. And I would just say that one of the strengths of this very, very good scheme is that that task force cohort made up of all sides of the debate have been very much involved. There's been great buy-in to the formation of this scheme, and there's a huge strength in that. So we have energy use, water use, social compliance, habitat, pollution, renewability, resource use efficiency. So every ingredient is counted against these criteria. It's quite complicated. Having been audited ourselves, as with many of the other companies in the UK, I can tell you it's not easy. In the case of, I've used here bark as an example, we have to go right back to the forest and gather all of the data across those 7 criteria for every part of this process. It's detailed and as I say, it's a lot of work. Here's an example of a decision tree for energy. We count up all the energy is converted into kilowatt hours, and then we score ourselves on this decision tree. In our case, this is our sawmill in Shropshire. This building here houses a huge trommel screen for our bark screening, but you can see it's amply covered in solar panels. So we're allowed to offset on our energy score the renewable energy that we're creating on site. This is another of the criteria, renewability. This is a very simple decision tree. A lot of the others are a bit more complicated than this, but I think you can get the picture of how the scheme is working. And I would say that we know that we haven't necessarily got all the scoring right at this stage. There's a lot of work going into benchmarking at the moment. Where should the red lines be drawn? And continual improvement of the scheme will be very much part and parcel of how it works in the future. And these are very much draft, but this is the sort of labelling that we're hoping will eventually appear on bags, but perhaps more quickly on point of sale, a little bit like the environmental impact statement that you get on the front of a fridge or a cooker. This is for growing media, and the grade, having scrutinized all of those ingredients and done a percentage weighting depending on the quantity of each ingredient in a growing medium, the final product will be given a score, and it is deemed that the scores will get harder to achieve as the industry moves forward. Getting a grade B in the future may be harder than it is today. Also that the ingredients will be listed. So what this scheme actually does is it brings a scrutiny, it brings evidence, it brings fact to an area that over the course of the debate there's been an awful lot of conjecture about peat and about other ingredients, not necessarily based on fact. Sometimes there's been quite a lot of emotion involved, and we feel that this really takes us forward into an area of evidence-based rather than conjecture. Finally, these two headlines are looking rather old compared to today's news, but they just perhaps indicate to you what's going on here in the UK. That just before Christmas, two announcements from two of our biggest retailers, both absolutely pledging to be out of peat within fairly short timescales. So I think, in my view, the question for the UK is not will we be getting out of peat, whatever we think about it, and I'm being very careful here not to cast too much of a view on it, but my thoughts on it are not when we get out of peat, but I think there is a question mark over the time scale, and whether we will be able to come up with some realistic alternatives that are commercially sensible, that do the job. How long that's going to take, who actually knows at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Catherine. Very useful and interesting to see what's happening in the UK. One question that came in from the audience. It seems that Brexit is a blessing in disguise for the horticultural industry and the future of non-peat alternatives. Things seem to go faster now. Would you agree?
I think Brexit has allowed our government to consider fiscal measures that were previously not possible. But all along they have been, when we've worked, our government has worked very hard on the responsible sourcing scheme. I forgot to include them in the list of organisations that have been involved. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought there, but they have been very aware of not exporting our peat problem as they see it by simply resorting to importation.
Good. Thank you so much. Again, as goes for you as for the other keynote speakers, if there's any more questions from the audience, we'll be back to you at a later stage. We continue now to a roundtable discussion with three different guests. We have Mr. Moritz Böking with us, CEO of Klasman Delman. We have Peter van den Dool with us, Company Development Officer van the Knap Group, and we have Hein Boon with us from RHP. And we see all these gentlemen already with us now on screen. Welcome all. Thank you so much for being with us.
let's start with our first panelist, Mr. Moritz Böking. Mr. Böking, we happen to know that your daughter is vegetarian, and probably just like most of her friends. Millennials, Generation Z, they act, they think differently, and the world changes exponentially. So peat will be phased out. In the meantime, the demand for substrates will increase tremendously. If your daughter would be CEO of Klasman Dijlman tomorrow, would she step into your strategic footsteps?
She's working for a little catering company right now in her vacations, and she's really involved, as you said, Renee, in food. I think, you know, we see at home, many of us, but also our children, are extremely concerned about where food is produced, where it comes from, how it is shipped around the globe, and we have to find answers to that. Rightfully, those questions are being put. I think what Cecilia told, and you did it very well, Cecilia, we're jointly together there in GME working on this issue. I think really we see a strong demand, and we've been seeing it over the last 15, 20 years. Every year there's more demand for indoor grown food, and also ornamentals, of course, and that's on the global scale. So the shipments of growing media that we see that go from Europe elsewhere into Asia, into Africa, into South America, in the US, this has been growing ever since. So it's not only the European market that is growing, but also the demand over the ocean. And this is something we want to bring to the table when we discuss with policymakers, both in Brussels. We're a German company. We talk a lot about the use of peat and growing media, the importance of growing media in the German market. This is what we want to bring to the table. That is not only the carbon that's carried, well, with this raw material peat, and the footprint a growing media has, but it's also the need for growing media to produce ornamentals and food. And maybe to finish that first point, Ed, I think it's you know, we've been in this COVID-19 situation now for 15 months or even longer, and here's this European industry. You know, we have about 750,000 people working in the horticulture industry, and they were able to produce food and ornamentals ever since 24/7. We were able to supply the market, the people of Europe, and that was also because we have European growing media. Most of the raw materials that we use, most of the production sites that we run, they're all here in Europe. So this is something of relevance. We're an independent industry, almost to full, that we should bring to the table too.
Thank you, Mr. Böking. We will be back to you in a bit. Let's go to Peter. Peter, you work at Van der Knap Group. Like Melcourt, you're involved in supplying a peat alternative. As we've been discussing, and it's clear for everybody, at least in a European context, peat is under increasing pressure. But when we talked to you preparing this session, it's also clear that cocoa or cocoa peat cannot live up or fulfill all the demand that's coming towards you now in the coming years. So if we're facing the problem that peat is no longer allowed, but cocoa peat cannot supply or replace, what do? Because we've got a serious problem here.
Correct. You see an increasing demand of growing media, and cocoa peat is one of the alternatives. And we have a dedicated team working on to get the cocoa peat from all our different production plants all through the world. That's one. But I think also via Growing Media Europe, we should be working together to look to other alternatives as well, and to see if we can manage to get the right availability for to create enough raw material to produce all the substrates for the growing needs. Because I think that not only focusing on cocos, but also on other raw materials, and working together with all the partners in Growing Media Europe.
Thank you, Peter. Our final panelist is Mr. Hein Boon, Director of RHP. Hein, 3 words define your vision on the future of substrates: environmental impact, responsible production, and quality. And we fully understand why you have chosen these 3 cornerstones. And let's just assume that most of us online agree with you. we are the professionals, we are the world of hydroponics. However, society might disagree with you and thus with us. What needs to be done to ensure that society is on board as well?
I think the key word there is communication. Communication about the impact of the various growing media, responsible production and quality. Communication about a holistic view of that approach. And I experienced also recently that growing media are so simply overlooked in the whole production chain of vegetables, flowers, potted plants. It all starts with growing media, but consumers and retail chains simply don't have an open eye for what growing media discussion really is. So our efforts are to come in discussion with these retail organizations and get them understand what the holistic view means. And I have experienced that there is an open ear for that discussion. But first coming on the table, that's a challenge. And we need all involved, also growers, to make that step come through. Because if, for instance, IKEA asks a grower, please change to non-peat containing growing media, the grower can make that step, of course. He should fulfill the wishes of his customer. But on the other hand, he should not jeopardize his crop and his results, his profit. And in that respect, you cannot simply stay away from taking chances with your crop. I think an in-depth communication is very worthwhile.
Thank you, Hein. Mr. Böking, question from the audience is coming in. As Klasman Belman, you are still very much focused on peat, but you're working on alternatives. The question is, what happens if the alternatives turn out to be worse for the environment than peat? How do you guarantee that your alternatives are really sustainable?
Well, we've been working with alternative constituents as being green fiber, as being bark, as being green waste compost, all kinds, and coir. We've been working for many, many years. The growing demand is asking all the industry to use all high quality raw materials that we can get at the same time. So I think it's not the question peat or coir or bark, but we need it all. If you follow those studies from the Wageningen University, the demand will widely increase. Now, Klasman is committed to quality, so we've been, before trying something, we've been looking, we do intensive trials in our own greenhouses. We do trials together with our customers, and then we decide to blend alternative constituents with peat. We've been having reduced the amount of peat in our sales mixes to 15% by the end of last year. Our next step will be 30% in professional growing media for our company. And we are turning around about 4.5 million cubic meters of growing media. So you can imagine it's not easy to get your hands on alternative constituents, because what we're learning is to capture those amounts, you need to invest heavily. About 3/4 of the investments in Klasman we spend on green fiber production facilities. We just closed a partnership with a green waste supplier. We closed a partnership with Schachti Coir, a leading coir producer. And so we're investing heavily and we are learning, but one thing we're trying to communicate as much as we can, that it needs time. You cannot change the recipe quickly. It needs time. This we have learned over the 100 years that we are in this business. It needs time to change recipes. Together with growers, we need to do the trials. And when we look at Germany, for example, the discussion on the use of peat is pretty much on the timelines. So the ambitious timelines the government, both in Berlin, but also in Brussels, we have seen that, are putting forward, are not aligned with the quality aspects and the demand for growing media and for food and for ornamentals. This is a problem.
Let's pick it up from here and go to Hein for a second. We learned from Catherine and from Tim that there was this announcement in the UK today being made that by 2024, 2028, but it will be phased out. Peat will be phased out. In the meantime, the UK is a gardening country. The demand, especially in a country like the UK, will stagger. It will rise for substrates in general. I just heard Mr. Böking saying that it needs time. It needs time. Well, we don't have time. So how are we going to solve this, Hein?
Well, we already started years ago creating tools and knowledge to be able to implement other materials in a peat-based growing medium. Till now, and we expect for the next many years, peat might be a backbone for the application of other materials. But in order to do that in a predictable way, you need to have knowledge, and that knowledge can't be a trial and error knowledge. That should be based on how do we make changes in the growing system to have a successful crop. And that's being put in practice over the years and in the coming years. And whether that fits with the time scale of going to less peat in growing media, I don't know. But as soon as both sides of the discussion, stakeholders, authorities and growers understand what's possible in a certain time frame, I think that understanding will come. But the industry is making.
I understand both of you perfectly. We need time. We need to ensure quality to our clients. We need to ensure quality to the end producer. That requires time. But Peter, how do you see the situation? Let's just assume that it's going to be a fact that by 2024 there will be no more peat in the UK. What's going to happen over there? I mean, what are producers, what are consumers going to do?
Well, I think that they made the wrong decision over there because, well, to answer your question, we have an alternative already for the UK. But if other countries also will be banning peat, I think they're making a wrong decision. We are happy that we already have 50% of our raw materials that we use is non-peat. So it's already an alternative substrate. So we can manage to deliver still the UK, but I think we should be talking with each other and also use the life cycle analysis of all the raw materials and combine all the raw materials to make to come to the needs of the customer, to make sure that he can grow his plants, fruits, vegetables as efficient as possible with less impact to the global world.
So, Mr. Böking, I think what Peter is saying, that's exactly what you're doing. You are talking to your customer, you are preparing alternatives, and you are talking to policymakers. The thing I'm missing in this discussion, we already mentioned it slightly, but the discussion with society, how are we going to spark that discussion?
Well, the discussion with the society is a little single-minded there. What we're seeing here in Germany, to be quite frank with you, and I support what Peter just said, let me say that, I think it's wrong what Great Britain decided. They have, with Ireland, they have a country full of peat, and they've been using this peat to be independent and to serve this large growing media market, this large growers market, and now they want to switch to import of wood chips from Georgia, US. So the impact on the climate will be much worse with all these decisions. And the same is true for Germany, to phase out of peat, to use, to put your bets on forestry wood chips, where you had huge storms in Germany. There's no more trees in the forests. The bark beetle has, it was really devastating. So putting your bets on materials that you believe are more sustainable, they are not indeed, the LCAs will show, it will risk the food supply. And this is just wrong. But to give you an answer, I think it needs time. I think it needs a lot of webinars like this. This we have learned over this time, that you can get access to many people. Now, probably the ones confronted with this are the hobby users, so the end consumer. In Germany, the target of the current German government is to phase out of peat by 2026 in hobby. So it's very similar to the target of the UK government. So they will learn that the prices will increase. Quality might not be the same, might be a little difficult. And certainly a lot of raw materials in those hobby bags will be imported from way out somewhere, but it's not going to be produced locally for sure. So this is, it's a concern.
On local production, a question came in for Peter, and I think you've heard this before, Peter, but how do you explain sustainability of cocoa when it's shipped from so far away? What do you do to explain that aspect to your growers, or at least to the consumers probably, and what do you do about it?
Well, that's a good question. We also look into that, and that's why we think it's a good idea to have a transparent view of all the raw materials that we can use and the impact of the environment of all the different materials, and take into account all the complete supply chain of that, and also includes transport, of course. So we have the opportunity to compress our raw materials 5 times smaller, so we can fit a lot of the raw materials into containers. So that will save a lot of transport cost and the impact of transportation, of course. And next to that, we look to the complete supply chain of core as a renewable resource. And also in the end, after our growers used the cocoa peat as a substrate, they can reuse it in other greenhouses as well, for other plants or gardening reasons.
Let me go back just for 1 second to what Mr. Böking was just saying, that we need more webinars like that we need more events like this. And the question is for Hein, in fact. I fully agree, we need to talk, we're all worried. I mean, when you grow pot plants, when you grow tomatoes in Mexico, there's a lack of peat, cocoa peat, I'm sorry. There will be a lack of peat, there are problems. We need discussions like this, but in the meantime, it's policymakers who take final decisions. Shouldn't we organize much more webinars like this, directed to consumers, to gardeners, to people who consume healthy food? But Mr. Böking, let me first add this to Hein.
Go ahead, Hein, please.
Okay, thank you. Because I'd like to add something in this discussion, and that is responsibly produced peat. If you make the comparison with responsible production of wood, I think a decade ago, FSC scheme and the PEFC production scheme have been developed to prove that wood can be produced sustainably. And the peat industry thinks that peat cannot be produced sustainably, but it can be produced responsibly. And I think if we follow that scheme, degraded peatlands are being used, peatlands are being restored after use. If we can get that message across, it still will be possible to use that raw material. And because I think currently a major part of the discussion is based on emotion, and when we come to rational discussion, it can be done responsibly. And I hope that if we have the ability to organize more webinars and get better communication across, we gain time because we need the time.
I'd like to ask Catherine Dawson, if she's still with us, if she could open her microphone and her camera for a second, just to comment on what has been said so far. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Well, quite a lot's just been said. Which particular aspect would you like me to talk about? I mean, I think
I would like that question that you just mentioned. I would ask it to Catherine. Should we ask, or should we do more of these events? Well, targeting consumers, but also Mr. Böking was heavily into that. So both of you could respond. Should we address consumers more?
And how?
On the consumers, we have a lot of very, very keen gardeners in the UK who are very, they read gardening magazines, they watch the very regular television programs, which we have many of in this country, and they're regularly told by those sort of broadcast, those media outlets that peat-free is the thing. However, the vast majority of the people going into a garden centre and buying a bag of compost or into a DIY store are not engaged with those platforms, and so they may not even know that there's peat in a bag, never mind peat-free. And it's a very, very expensive process in terms of marketing to try and get the message over to that very large number of people. Now, I think it's beginning to really happen here, and headlines like today's will make people think, oh, what's that all about? Some people will have never even heard of that. And as I say, many people never even aware that there's peat in a bag. And anyway, what is peat? You know, there's a huge lack of knowledge amongst a lot of the people who are buying 1 or 2 bags of compost a year, but they make up this, you know, very large, in excess of 4 million cubic meters that we sell on the retail front in this country each year. So, but I agree that communication is always surely the best thing. And I would say I always try very hard to keep out of the actual debate about peat itself. I'm not a peatland expert, so I'm not qualified to do so, but I've sat in enough meetings over the years to hear these things. And one of the big Achilles heel, I think, for peat is the lack of renewability. Yes, you can restore a worked peatland. Restoring it to what it was, however, takes an awful lot longer. You can make a wetland, but I'm really straying out of my knowledge zone here. But these are the things that I pick up having sat in meetings, that it's the renewability aspect. And our responsible sourcing scheme does pick up actually on some of the things. For instance, when we drill down into coir, gets a lot of flack for it, you know, it comes all that way. Yes, it does. But actually, when you look at how it comes, compressed, dried by ship, actually the contrast between moving stuff by lorry, say from the north of Scotland down to the south of England, the contrast isn't quite so stark as people would think. And that's where evidence is necessary, and followed up by communication.
Mr. Böking, here you go.
Well, I can just support what everybody else said. We need these roundtables. We've been doing roundtables ever since with NGOs, with policymakers. We are trying at all times to include the growers, because we're talking about growers, how to grow a plant. That's what we're talking about. That's the most important thing. And I think key to success for our industry will be to very, very close with our customers in order to communicate why we need growing media, why we need more growing media in the future, and why we should not only talk about the quality in climate terms of our raw materials, but also about how to source those locally. Because this is one of the prime concerns of the EU when they set out the farm to fork strategy, to not have stuff being shipped around the globe all the time, but have it produced locally. And here, this industry is so good. What is grown in greenhouses all across Europe, that's being produced locally to serve local people. So why change that? That's, I think, a very important aspect we should put forward. What we have seen in Ireland, when the state decided not to use the local available peat anymore, the growers only then learned that now they have to import from the Baltics or Scandinavia. And of course, the impact on the climate is much worse. So those things, I think, probably will need some time. Maybe it even needs time for policymakers to take a decision first and then learn later, as we saw in England before, that it doesn't work. But again, you know, we're trying as much as we can as a company, as being a driving member of Growing Media Europe, to communicate as much as we can with the public and with policymakers on why growing media is so important. And Hein, you mentioned RPP. I think here's something which is really, really relevant when we talk about peatlands. The use of peatlands for growing media, for the growing media peat, is very, very low, very limited. More than 98% of Europe's peatlands are used for agriculture. And here, our industry can make a huge change. We can help to restore those lands that emit the carbon, most of the carbon. And this is the key, this is the heart. Now, the lobbying of farmers in Brussels, and the same is true for Germany, I would say, is very strong. But I think here's something where we can really make a change and support the target to save the climate a little more.
So let's
restore peatlands that are previously agriculture used.
Let's say Cecilia to join us for a second to figure out. We talked already about how to reach out to society. That's a tricky one. That's an expensive one, but it can be done, I think, in a more intelligent way. But besides that, there's a lobby going on in Brussels, in Berlin. Cecilia, you're part of that. You got a challenge.
Oh, yes. Yes, we are. And maybe you don't know, we are a very small association. We are only 2 people working full-time for Growing Media Europe, and we have all those topics on our agenda. But like I said, we have recently stepped up our efforts. We have created a public affairs working group. We are now cooperating with a professional public affairs company who helps us, and we really increased the level of direct interaction with decision makers, political decision makers, NGOs, other related industries. We have so far not really tackled the general public, simply because of a lack of resources, not because we think it's not that important, but you have to kind of choose your battles. And for us, the political decision makers were always top priority, because of course, you know, the earlier in the process you start to influence, the bigger your success. Normally, once something is already publicly debated, and Hein said it, the debate about peat, it's similar to glyphosate. It's emotional, it's about ideology, it's not science-based. And it's very hard to win those debates. You know, you can basically just fight back with emotions yourself, because there's always the risk that when it gets too emotional, nobody cares anymore about scientific arguments, right? So I'm not saying that that's already where we are. Not on European level, we're not there yet, luckily. It's really so far more a topic that is in certain member states quite a thing. But of course, we are trying everything to educate decision makers as early as possible before they take decisions that are then difficult to revert back.
So here we are. We are here representing the world of horticulture. Horticulture can be referred to as maybe the most sustainable way of producing food. Controlled environment agriculture is the way to go. More and more people are convinced about it. But if you compare horticulture to any other sector, even within the agricultural sector, it's a very fragmented sector. There's a lot of relatively small companies, let's say between 50 and 200 million dollar turnover, who make this sector worldwide. It's the most innovative, most international sector we have in the Netherlands, where I was born and raised. But we are represented in Brussels, talking about substrates, by Cecilia and one colleague. We have a communication problem with society. Shouldn't we grow up as a sector?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have founded growing media only about Europe about only 5 years ago, and we are not representing the growers, right? We are representing the producers of growing media, and I was actually surprised when I started working for Growing Media Europe to learn that there is no European growers association. So there is AIPH International, yes, and as far as I understood, for ornamentals only. There's no European Growers Association pushing horticulture, promoting horticulture on a European level. The European Farmers Association has one person who is in charge of horticulture, but also in charge of 5 other topics. So it's not a lot of resources there either. And that's a bit a pity, because it's such a, like what I said, there's really a transformation going on in horticulture, and horticulture is somehow part of the solution of the most pressing problems we have as a society. So it should be much higher on the political agenda. And we often, feel that we are not properly acknowledged. You can theoretically attend a 2-day event. I did end of 2019, a 2-day event organized by the European Commission on the future of food production in Europe. The word horticulture was not mentioned once in 2 days, where you have, I don't know, 30 expert speakers and discussions going on. It's all about the conventional or organic agriculture, and horticulture isn't mentioned once.
So we don't have a seat at the table when there's a World Economic Forum, or when there's we are diving into the World Food System Summit in New York recently, and we're talking to representatives from the Dutch government in Washington. We're talking to the Dutch government themselves. What are we going to do? We got plans to be there, but we don't have a seat at the table. I'm tempted to go to Mr. Böking right now, but Peter, from a Dutch perspective, from a private perspective, what needs to be done?
Well, I think something is already happening with our customers. They are joining together as a group and thinking about the farm to fork, for example, is one that they are joining in the discussion. So they are also looking into possibilities to get in communication with the end customers and with the people that need to be included in this discussion. But I think it's a little bit late. Well, not too late, don't get me wrong, but we all started a little bit late with communication, I think.
So Hein, you represent, at least in the Netherlands, a lot of those suppliers. It's a bit late. Horticulture became big because of collaboration. I mean, in the Netherlands, cooperative banks, cooperative auctions, study clubs, it was all working together. That's how we became who we are right now. And we did it together with companies from Germany, step by step, and we are now all over the world. But it started with collaboration. We don't have multinationals like in many other sectors. So that's probably one of the main reasons why we are not having that seat at the table. So isn't collaboration the key word to work it all out?
I think you're right in that respect, and I think the basis of RHP is collaboration, and that started already in 1963. All Dutch growing media producers were looking for knowledge, and they created that themselves, and that was the beginning of RHP. And that's being recognized in the world because half of our participants are international companies like Glassman, like Van de Knap and 70 others. So collaboration is a thing, but we are also part of our success is also, yeah, how do you call it? Playing not a positive role, because as industry we have organized many things in such a way. In the Netherlands we hardly have any legislation for growing media because it was not necessary. The industry organized it themselves. So by doing that, we were playing our role in part of the chain and not communicating that. And like Peter said, we are late in communication, but not too late. It's being recognized. And a month ago, we organized 5 webinars for RHP participants to share knowledge about the transition in growing media, to use the other constituents in a successful growing medium. We organized 3 webinars for international advisors to growers. 280 people signed in for these webinars. So the communication is there, and this is partly happening because of COVID. We didn't do it before, but things are happening, being picked up, and with this speed, things will improve rapidly.
And everybody else was slowly moving towards the end of this session. A few more questions came in from the audience, and one a bit more technical one for you, Hein. The following one: the past years, all methods to get specifications on our substrates, like physical aspects, were based on peat-based growing media. But now we see that these methods do not always give accurate methods or accurate results on physical characteristics of non-peat alternatives. How do you research that these results are more correct, or that you, how to say, also research these non-peat based alternatives to get accurate physical aspects?
Yeah, an example of that is that we have developed a WOC parameter, water uptake characteristic. In the past, the water holding capacity was a very important thing, but a plant doesn't feel that. But the speed of water uptake is very important. So that tool or that analysis has been developed also with other constituents in the back of our head. Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And one thing to add, it was mentioned that the development of wood fibers or organic fibers is picking up rapidly. And that's a field of interest which we are working on. We recently started a project to characterize organic fibers and the needs to have tools to measure that. That project will run for a year likely, and that's exactly that we, with new materials, have new methods but most of the characterization can take place with what we already have. But there, where necessary, we invest ourselves as industry to come further.
Let's try to wrap this up. I think there's a common interest here. We all want to supply our pot plant producers, our cut flower producers, our vegetable producers with quality substrates produced in a sustainable way. That's what consumers want. That's what policymakers want. We need more communication. I would like to invite Tim to explain to us how AIPH, the organization that represents at least the world of floriculture, what role do you see for yourself, Tim? Based on this webinar, what next steps should be taken?
Well, thanks, Ed, Rene. Thanks to all of the panelists and the speakers today. I really appreciated all the input that you've put in there and all your knowledge that you've shared. It's interesting, isn't it, how to conclude a discussion like this. For me, it's a little strange. On the one hand, I'm here representing an international organization, and yet I sit in the UK, and I remember 20 years ago similar discussions that we had here about this subject. And I think the whole debate has developed from starting with peat and the issues around peat, and for some reason it never left the list of the regulators and the NGOs, whereas really the subject has changed. I think it is unfortunate that the focus of the new UK announcement is about peat, because it's not addressing the issue fundamentally. It's addressed where what we have discussed today is about sustainable growing media, which is something that's why we called the webinar that. It's not about peat. And the sustainable sourcing scheme in the UK is based on the fact that it's to try and find sustainable growing media. And if it is possible to demonstrate that peat is or not, is almost not the point. The point is to get the best and most sustainable media that you can and how you access it. So that is the challenge that I see of our industry. And peat is just something which has been latched onto as part of that process. But as an industry, we have a responsibility to be sustainable and to demonstrate sustainability. And on the one hand, it's good to focus on, we can focus on the end product. Sure, we're producing things which contribute to sustainability of the world, but we have to be able to show that throughout the chain. I think it's very useful to have the life cycle analysis work, which has been talked about, the work in developing sustainable sourcing. And this is information I hope we can share more internationally together. There was a time when I bought a diesel car thinking I was helping the environment by not having a petrol car. There was a time when I had a car which used less diesel than the one before, and now I have an electric one. And things have changed, maybe because of legislative pressure, but the world does change. And as an industry, I think the call to action on the industry to take responsibility is a useful one. And Hein talked about this, many things, take control of the issue and the solution amongst ourselves as an industry is much better. It was great to hear about 85%, I think, of expenditure by Klausman on investment is in looking for the alternatives. And you are all an industry actively seeking to develop sustainable solutions. So it's not something that's going to go away, but let's work to demonstrate that sustainability that we are finding through that process. In the UK, we don't have the time. We say we need time to change. We've said that for 20 years, and now the government here, they're not interested in that anymore. Time is not necessarily going to be on our side, but we do need to work together to find those solutions, because a sustainable horticulture industry is necessary for a sustainable solutions for the planet and beyond. And that element of the supply chain can help to meet that need. Clearly, the big challenge is availability. is the alternative as sustainable as it needs to be? And that's the challenge we all have to get our head around. That's the challenge we have to communicate to regulators, to policymakers, to environmentalists, so that together we can find those solutions and to meet those challenges. But with good brains like we've had today in this discussion, I am confident we'll find a way forward together. And if AIPH can help in this, and FCI, we will continue to promote that. We'd like to do some more articles to stimulate discussion on this topic through FCI, and I hope we can involve you all in that process. And thanks again, thanks to Ed and Renee for chairing the sessions, and for all the panelists and speakers. And I'm also confident that we will not just be growing potatoes in the end, and that it will be something that we have an industry that is able to meet many more solutions. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Just a few final words from our side here from Costa Rica. Renee and I had the privilege about 5 years ago to invite National Geographic to come over to the Netherlands. That led to a story that kind of shook the world of horticulture in the Netherlands. This tiny country feeds the world was the title. It was written by a war correspondent from the US. It was great. It was even picked up by Mr. David Attenborough, who put it in his life work last year. He had a world record on Instagram, being 94 years old, and he spoke about horticulture. He's a biologist. He spoke about horticulture. To me, it kind of proves that we should learn from that. We should communicate by using the pull strategy instead of the push strategy. And I think that's where many things go wrong. We know that we are super sustainable as a sector, that we got great things to offer to society. But the way we communicate with society, that can be improved. And I would like to challenge you all to take this back home and to think about it. And I want to thank you all, Mr. Böking, Cecilia, Hein, Peter, and all the others, and of course Horticulture International and AIPH for making this possible. And we hope to see you soon. Regards from Costa Rica.
Thank you, and have a good day.